Hello, everyone. Today we want to talk about how sexual abuse is regarded in the Japanese pop industry, and especially how sexual abuse towards men is underestimated in Japan. While such a massive industry cannot be generalized and has within itself many different facets and subcultures, we made the choice to narrow down our focus onto a particular case that caused significant polarization within the Japanese society. Therefore, today we're going to talk and discuss the case of Johnny Kitagawa and his company Johnny's and Associates. Firstly, the terminology of grooming in the context of sexual abuse refers to the deliberate actions and strategies employed by an adult to establish a connection, trust, and control over a child in order to prepare them for sexual exploitation. To understand how this is connected to our research, we must firstly introduce Johnny Kitagawa, the founder of Johnny's and Associates. He was one of the most powerful and richest figures in the Japanese entertainment industry and was widely admired and popular for his quote unquote gourmet eye for young beautiful boys. His company, Johnny and Associates, has ignited some of Japan's top pop acts, and it has its main focus on producing young male idols. They have a predominant market position within the Japanese music industry and are considered by many the most powerful idol agency. The recruitment process for new talents involved an initial screening by Kitagawa himself, and from there on, he made all the major decisions. Most boys started as young as 11 years old, and it was company practice that as soon as they were taken in, they would partly start living in company dormitories. Favored boys were invited to Kitagawa's private penthouse dorms, where most of the reported abuses took place. In the case of Kitagawa, we can see that power relations, so his power to decide who gets famous, combined with dorms as a perceived safe space, acted as a facilitation for his grooming. In May this year, the BBC published a documentary on this topic. I will talk about this in a minute. However, it's important to note that accusations of sexual abuse by Kitagawa were not new. In 1999, the abuse claims by the weekly magazine Shukan Bonshu led to global media coverage, including newspapers like the New York Times. Despite 12 interviews and 2 testimonies at the Tokyo High Court, these claims were deemed true, but finally ruled in Kitagawa's favor. So instead of being legally prosecuted, his reputation within the industry grew even more. You can see that in an example from 2005, where an influential producer states, "As a producer, I'm not interested in rumors of sex scandals. It doesn't concern people like us who are making programs." McNeil, 2023, argues that in liberal democracies, the mass media is an essential element of civil society, a public watchdog monitoring abuses and crimes by the powerful. So here, the point of lack of domestic media coverage is really important. Back then, none of the big media outlets were interested in reporting in a bad way about Kitagawa or his agency. This can be regarded to their dependency on the agency. So, for example, in order to be provided with new talents and to be get able to access to popular faces for TV shows and talk shows, media outlets had a high interest to maintain a good relationship with the agencies like Johnny's and Astor. The publishing of the BBC documentary this year forced major news outlets in Japan to pick up this topic, mostly because various former stars from Johnny's and Associates afterwards came out. For example, TV Asahi and NHK expressed their shock at the allegations and their shame for not having done more before. However, these newspapers gave the company directly after publishing the articles the chance to reply in form of a written statement, and in this way they gave the accused the same space as the victims. Also, shortly after the wave of articles came out, it very fast became quiet, so it cannot be expected that this will have a long lasting influence on the public.
Before deeply diving into Johnny Kitagawa's case, I'm gonna introduce sexual victimization of men in Japan as the foundation of the topic. Although sexual victimization of men has existed for a long time, it has not been considered the same as that of women according to Iwasaki's sexual victimization among males in Japan. So 2 questions I'm gonna try to answer through this presentation are why sexual abuse toward men is underestimated in Japan, and how does the Japanese society think about sexual abuse toward men. Today, I will consider this question by using the questionnaire about sexual abuse of men in Japan and connecting to Japanese male discourses seen in Proverb. Firstly, according to King, there are three factors why sexual abuse toward men is underestimated. The first myth about men, the ignorance of the possibility to be victims of sexual abuse among men, and the incomplete legal definition about sexual abuse of men. First of all, sexual abuse toward men is underestimated in Japan because men are believed to be able to resist sexual aggression. Iwasaki remarks the victims blame themselves, fail to understand why they cannot resist the attack, and question their masculinity, especially if they are male, which prevents them from talking about their experiences. According to an internet survey by NHK, some hesitated to talk about their experience because they are men. Some of them answered, "I thought no one would believe male sexual abuse, and I thought it would be unmanly to talk to someone about it." Moreover, the first myth about Japanese men, which means that it is man's prerogative to have sex with the opposite sex, make it difficult for the boy victim attacked by a woman victimizer to accept their experience as violence against his mind and body. In these ways, the existence of intense social pressures and forced myths make the male victimization less visible than for women, and the victims are less likely to seek the support. Second, sexual abuse among men are invisible because men might not believe that they are potential targets of sexual victimization as women be, and as a result may not realize that approaches of other men are sexual until it is too late. According to the internet survey by NHK, almost half of the male victims took more than 1 year to recognize them as a victim. Also, Japanese traditional custom hadaka no tsukiai, which means taking the bath together to get rid of emotional barrier, might make it vague that the border between sexual approaches and intimacy of friendship. As seen above, the unawareness of risk to be a target of sexual abuse among men and vague border between men's friendship and sexual approach are responsible for the underestimated sexual abuse toward men. Finally, in Japan, although the criminal code on sexual offenses was amended in 2017, prior to that, rape was defined as a crime committed by a man against a woman, and therefore, for statistical purposes, only female data was available on the victims. In this way, the political system itself consisted of Japanese society which overlooked sexual victimization of men until recently. This law was amended to cover victimization by others than women later. In summary, sexual victimization of men is disregarded in Japan because of the first myth about men, the ignorance of the possibility to be victims of sexual abuse among men, and the insufficient legal definition before 2017. And each factor somehow related to Japanese discourse about men and custom which regard men to be resistant to sexual abuse.
Now I hope to talk about some of the reasons that led the general public in Japan to react indifferently to the Kitagawa case. Specifically, I hope to focus on the challenges victims faced, the psychology of victims, and the reaction of Japanese society. According to the documentary, some victims were paid or offered opportunities to become famous by Kitagawa after being sexually abused. Through this strategy, Kitagawa aimed to keep the victims quiet, persuade them to drop their claims, and keep his problematic behavior hidden. We can also see how young idols were brainwashed, either by fellow trainees or their own parents, that being groomed or sexually abused by Kitagawa was necessary for them to become famous. In the documentary, one former idol claimed that his mother, who was a huge Johnny's and Associate fan, told him that he should dedicate his body to Kitagawa so that she can have a son who belongs to Johnny's and Associates. This shows that while brainwashing was happening, grooming and sexual abuse were also normalized, making it difficult for victims to identify Kitagawa's problematic behavior and even believing that they were truly loved by Kitagawa. Many scholars consider these victims as experiencing trauma bonding, which is a part of what is called the Stockholm Syndrome. This psychological phenomenon is said to be caused by an imbalance of power and the manipulative nature of the cycle of abuse with acts of kindness. In Kitagawa's case, he has the power to decide who gets to debut, so he manipulated young idols to obey his orders through acts of kindness that was actually grooming and sexual abuse. However, the closed-off nature of Johnny's and Associates, silenced victims, and the normalization of sexual abuse made it very hard for victims to speak up, seek help, or even comprehend the situation they are in. What about the general public? Towards the end of the documentary, several Japanese citizens were interviewed. Many reacted indifferently, stating that Kitagawa's fetishes and gayness were his own business, and that nobody has the right to judge or criticize. Some also felt uncomfortable commenting because Kitagawa has already passed, and it did not feel right to speak ill of the dead. However, what stood out to our group the most were these comments. The boys wanted to be famous, so giving their body to Kitagawa was the price they had to pay. It was impossible for Kitagawa and his very professional company to be at fault. It must have been the boys who wanted attention. These comments led us to want to discuss victim blaming in Japan. Victim blaming describes the perception that it is the victims that are responsible. According to Yamawaki, victim blaming is largely related to culture, specifically cultures with rigid gender role stereotypes. These cultures tend to have a higher degree of false belief, which in this case are rape myths. These rape myths then lead to victim blaming and shaming. From the many texts we read this semester, we saw that Japan is a culture with rigid traditional gender rules. And according to Yamawaki, this culture became the perfect breeding ground for false beliefs, therefore leading to intense victim blaming when incidents like the Kitagawa case happened. Yamawaki also pointed out that the victim blaming culture in Japanese society is very different than other cultures, as both men and women in Japan tend to victim blame, which makes victim blaming an even more severe problem. We'd like to conclude by answering the questions we posed at the beginning of our presentation. In the case of Johnny Kitagawa, sexual abuse was avoided and disregarded in the Japanese pop industry. Sexual abuse of men is underestimated in Japan, likely because of the many false beliefs surrounding men. Last but not least, the Japanese society reacted indifferently to the Kitagawa case, most unwilling to comment, and even more blamed the victims. While investigations are being demanded and carried out, our group continues to follow the aftermath of this incident, hoping that victims can get the closure they deserve and there can be change within the Japanese society. Here are the references. Thank you so much for listening.